Hi, everyone, and welcome. I'm Jonathan Tepperman. I'm Foreign Policy's Editor-in-Chief. Thanks, everyone, for joining us for this virtual dialogue, which FP is holding in partnership with the International Republican Institute. Our goal today is to explore how the novel coronavirus pandemic is affecting the Middle East protest movements. As you all know, over the last few years, we have seen a remarkable flowering of people-powered uprisings across the region. What was most inspiring about them, I think, was the fact that they were peaceful and inclusive, with people across Arab societies uniting to demand clean, competent, transparent government. But what's happened to all of these protest movements since the virus hit, and what does the future hold? To try and answer these questions and others, we're going to spend the next hour or so talking to some of the IRI's best experts, and we're going to focus on three countries in particular: Algeria, Lebanon, and Iraq. A few quick housekeeping notes before we start. The way things will go today is that I'm going to do a quick Q&A with Patricia Karam, who is the regional director for the Middle East and North Africa at the IRA. I'll then bring in our wider panel for a few questions from me, and then I'm going to open things up to questions from all of you. There are two ways you can ask questions. If you're logged in via the Zoom app, just click the Q&A button you'll see at the bottom of your screen and type your question in the window that pops up there. If you've joined us by phone, please email your questions to events@foreignpolicy.com. We also encourage you to join our conversation on social media. You can post questions or comments at the hashtag #LockdownRiseUp. Finally, we're going to take a couple of quick polls during the conversation to try and gauge your opinion, but I'm going to explain those later. For now, let's start the conversation with Patricia, the IRI's Middle East Director. Patricia, please turn on your camera and microphone, and we can get started. Hi, welcome. I understand you have some introductory comments you want to make.
Yes, Jonathan, thank you for your introduction. I wanted to first say a few words about the International Republican Institute, IRI, which is a democracy development organization that focuses on enabling citizen-centered governance. What this involves is everything from linking people to political parties and amplifying marginalized voices, helping strengthen civil society, and ensuring elections count. And we've been following closely the protests around the region, which we consider to be an expression of civic engagement and activism. And we want to help ensure these voices translate into what we like to call citizen responsive governance. COVID-19 presented these with challenges and opportunities. And again, my colleagues and friends will be talking specific, but I wanted to make a few overarching remarks in advance. The first observation that I wanted to make is that COVID-19 has been a godsend for authoritarian and undemocratic forces, enabling them to reassert themselves. Like everywhere around the world, I think the Arab world or Arab leaders introduced restrictive measures beyond those needing to contain COVID-19. In Algeria, COVID-19 really removed any uncertainty about the calculations of the regime and forced the Hirak to retreat in some ways. Hopefully Dalia will say more about this. In Lebanon, despite a sort of initial civic push for mitigation, regime and security forces forcibly destroyed remaining tents in the city to limit supposedly the spread of the virus. And again, I hope Sami will talk more about this. And then Hezbollah deployed at the same time a PR campaign that had it playing a central part in the response, or at least restoring its standing, or an effort to restore its standing. However, the pandemic has also exposed economic and social problems. Two of these contexts that we're going to look at depend on oil, and the drop in oil prices has led to budget shortfalls, which may force a reversal in the social contract. In Lebanon, the crisis and lockdown are compounding poverty and economic hardship that many Lebanese, or I should say most Lebanese, are facing. Beyond exposing problems, the pandemic has also revealed inadequacies in the state's own ability to adapt or respond to this unusual threat. In COVID-19 being or has proven to be, I should say, an equal opportunity virus. And again, opportunity may be the operative word here, because it has exposed health system shortfalls. Its spread could actually weaken the human and institutional infrastructure that's central to the apparatus of repression. In Iraq, and I'm sure that Sajjad's going to talk more about this, the virus has actually exposed flaws in the health system, and flaws that are due to mismanagement, that are due to conflict, that are due to corruption, as well as a lack of coordination that is needed. But more than that, it has exposed how plagued the system is by distrust of political institutions. And IRI's work in particular has managed to underline that this high distrust in the system and the lack of citizen buy-in for a government-led COVID response, which has further discredited the state. And finally, I think, just on the subject of opportunities, the pandemic has clearly created some opportunities for protesters, enabling them to reorganize, but also to take on some interesting innovations. So not only have they been in all of these settings at the forefront of some sort of a COVID response, mobilizing resources, disseminating information, but also new forms of organizing have started to emerge, with protesters adapting to COVID-19. And my colleagues, I think, will talk about this in more detail, but one example was a mobilization against the nomination of Prime Minister-designate Ali Allawi in Iraq, which happened through the hashtag No Shame in Masks, which was used to call on protesters to wear masks as protection, not just for tear gas, but against corona, or protection, against coronavirus. So again, protests moved to a citizen-led response, which with changed tactics, changed methods to fit the circumstance. And just to conclude, in Iraq, because the protesters had developed a habit of alternatives, because pre-pandemic they were used to sort of state-imposed curfews, social platforms allowed these voices to remain relevant. And again, the wide use of Twitter hashtags attracted media attention and highlighted a determination to frame these popular concerns about the health crisis into a wider message of social activism and political solidarity.
Well, that's a great overview, Patricia. I want to pick up on something that you said. You struck a note of cautious optimism, but optimism nonetheless. You mentioned that the economic crisis could lead to a new social contract, that the way that the crisis has exposed the ineffectiveness of government health systems could further undermine trust in government, et cetera. I want to push you on that by asking, these are very poor, unequal societies that have been that way for a long time. They've had very low levels of social trust for a very long time. There have been real questions about the competence of these countries' governments for a long time. So why do you think this time might be different? That is, that this crisis might lead to change, whereas previous ones haven't succeeded.
I wouldn't say necessarily that this would lead to change. I would say that, like, oftentimes crises allow for moments of sort of mobilization or tactical adaptations that are happening. And I think that, you know, this is happening right now. I think the confluence of sort of repression, exposure of existing sort of inefficiencies in terms of health system responsiveness, but also economic problems underlying it. I mean, it has been a perfect storm. So I think that this moment has sort of enabled a sort of confluence of disaffection and a sort of sense that, you know, we've had enough. Not seeing any positive, any constructive, any positive future in what exists. But again, the protest has also, what's interesting is protesters have seen this moment as a chance, in my opinion, to sort of reorganize, to create a kind of political strategy and a capacity that they may have failed to forge. But I do think that this is a moment where in all of these countries, people have nothing to lose. So, you know, this brings a lot of opportunity.
And is there any evidence that this crisis, which after all affects everybody and is as existential as crises can get, is bringing new people into the protest movement, new demographics, new sectors of society that maybe had sat on the sidelines until now?
Well, I wouldn't put it necessarily this way. And again, my colleagues in Lebanon and Iraq as well can sort of talk more about this. But I think the pandemic has triaged in a way the scene, the protest scene, has forced some out. So because of economic and health burden, or forced others to reorient their messaging to sort of public health awareness. It has reshaped the scene, I think, not by introducing new voices necessarily, but changing the configuration of the scene, changing the focus, and kind of helping some of these protesters to take advantage and include like a public health response. And again, as I mentioned before, I think some activists saw this as an opportunity to develop a political strategy or create an institutional basis for a more enduring presence in the terrain. And I think that this may manifest itself in the future as sort of more ties with political parties or traditional actor, or more systematic linkages to civil society, or even to organized labor. And unions, I mean, in particular, have had a role, and they've often depended on state support for survival. So now maybe a time to sort of reach out to unions. We at IRI, you know, our support sort of would like to help maximize the efficacy of a fight for transparency, accountability, and freedom. And because of that, we hope to be able to help equip some of these civic actors and organizations with tools to adapt to both the public health crisis, but also beyond, in kind of making the connections that they need to sustain their existence.
Is there any sign that the economic crisis all the governments in the region are facing, especially those that are heavily dependent on oil with the plummeting in oil prices, that is weakening their ability to repress their societies, that it's eroding the mechanisms of state repression because they simply can't afford it in the way they once could?
Quite the contrary. I mean, I think Sajjad may laugh when he hears me, but there is one analyst that I like very much at Chatham House who talks about ideation of authoritarians. And, you know, when sort of the other tools are not available to you to buy off, you know, support, then you turn towards repression. And right now, violence has become the go-to of many of these governments who don't have sort of the ability to secure support or ensure that, you know, ensure that some of these voices die down. That said, I mean, we have some positive developments in say, in Iraq, potentially already, you know, a new prime minister has been confirmed by parliament after 2 unsuccessful tries. And this is a person who comes from, I mean, he was head of the intelligence, but he's been taking immediate action to show some of his bona fides in some ways. And in doing so, some of the actions he's taken has been to release some of the protesters who've been imprisoned, or you know, provide some helping some of the families of the protesters who were imprisoned with some remuneration, and kind of reassuring the protesters. But I'm sure Sajjad will talk about this. But the jury's still out, but there's no doubt that, you know, the first sort of remark that I made having to do with the virus being the ally of authoritarian has proved to be more of the rule than the exception.
So since we keep mentioning our panelists, let's bring them in. But before we do, we want to do a quick audience poll. A window should now be popping up on your Zoom screen with the polling question. And it's very simple. Are you optimistic or pessimistic about the popular movement's ability, the protesters' ability to adapt to and withstand the pandemic? Please submit your responses. We'll tally them very quickly, give you the results, and then we are going to open things up to the panel. And then we're going to take this poll at the end of the conversation and see if anyone's minds have changed. Just waiting for the results now. And here they come. 40%, 48% are optimistic. So unless we have some abstainers, that means 52% are pessimistic. But I would say for the Middle East, only 52% being pessimistic is pretty good. That's with 70% of our results in, and we may be getting more. But rather than wait, let me bring in the rest of our panel. So this is an intercontinental dialogue today. I'm in Brooklyn. Patricia is in Washington, but joining us from Beirut, we have Dalia Ghanem. Dalia is a resident scholar at the Carnegie Middle East Center, and she is an Algeria expert. Also in Beirut is Sami Nader, who's the director of the Levant Institute for Strategic Affairs. And unfortunately, you won't be able to see Sami's face except in the photo below because there he is. He was having bandwidth problems, but he's joined us now. And then finally in Baghdad is Sajjad Jihad. Sajjad is an Iraq analyst and visiting fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. Welcome to all of you. Please turn on your cameras and unmute your microphones and join the discussion. So Dalia, if you're with us, I think you're still muted. If you can unmute, there you are. Hi. So let me start with you. It's good to see you. It's been about a year since Algeria's popular uprising forced out the longtime president, Abdelaziz Bouteflika. I'd like you to start by describing the situation there today. How much have things changed since the uprising? What is the new government like? Have things liberalized at all since this massive and seemingly successful uprising a year ago? And let's not focus on the coronavirus now, but just talk about how things have changed in the last year.
Sure. As you said, the Hirak started on February 22nd, 2019. And for now, I would say, without any pessimism, just, saying facts, the real tangible result of this Hirak has been the exit of former President Abdelaziz Bouteflika, who have been in office for 20 years. This is the only real tangible result. As for the rest, unfortunately, the system has been, the same. The regime is, as strong as before, and the military are still the one who are calling the shots, meaning behind the scene. So what happened since then? So on the political level, we have a country that is in a political impasse. While it is true that elections happen and Abdelmajid Tebboune has been, elected between quotes president on December 13, 2019, it is also true that Abdelmajid Tebboune has a serious legitimacy deficit. So protesters accuse Tebboune of being a man of the system, of course, and a member of what they call al-isaba, which means the gang, meaning the political insiders who have been and the oligarch who have been in the regime, associated with the previous regime, and whose own son actually was in prison over a cocaine trafficking scandal. So all short, to say it bluntly, the system is still there and the regime is as strong as ever. To add a layer of complexity to this political impasse and to this already very complicated situation, there is the economic situation. So just to give you a few numbers and a clear idea of the economic situation today in Algeria, where is Algeria standing on the economic side? we have a situation that is deteriorating. The overall GDP growth rate was already low, and it is, you know, in a rapid decline. We have a rapid decline also in foreign exchanges. You know, Algeria used to be the world's eighth largest holder of exchange reserve in 2013, with something approaching the $200 billion. And today, these exchanges reserve are actually melting. We have also, you know, an inflation, a terrible inflation. We have unemployment that was already on the rise and is expected to go higher. And we have the depreciation of the dinar that depreciated between 2015 and 2020, approximately 49%. It lost 49% of its value. To this, you have to add, you know, all those enterprises and firms that closed. According to the Center of Young Algerian Leaders, they estimated job losses around 714,000, mainly in the private sector. So there is a serious economic crisis, and to that we need to add the social problems. For now, I think la question sociale, or the social question, hasn't been at the heart of the Hirak. When Algerians took up to the street in February 2019, they asked for the departure of the Bouteflika. Then they asked for Yitnahawga, which means you will all be removed. Then they asked for a civilian state, not a military state. But they never asked for more jobs, for, you know, better housing, for better condition. They asked for post-materialist values, dignity, freedom. But now I think when the Hirak will be back in the street, we will have la question sociale in the heart of their demands. And again, the question, as you said and Patricia said earlier, is whether this Hirak is going to remain peaceful, meaning whether we will still hear silmiya, or this is going to transform into something more radical, as we've seen it in Lebanon lately.
I want to remind our audience to please start sending in questions now. You don't have to wait until the Q&A, which will be coming in a few minutes. And you can do that on your Zoom app or by emailing them to events@foreignpolicy.com. When you send in your questions, please tell us your name and your organization and where you are joining us from. Dalia, Algeria has had Africa's highest death toll from COVID-19. What effect is that having on the protest movement? Is the fear of infection keeping people at home, or is the government's extremely ineffective response? And Johns Hopkins University recently ranked Algeria as one of the least prepared countries in the world. Is that mobilizing even more protesters?
What happened is that at the beginning of the COVID-19, when the Algerian government asked Algerians to stay home, and this shows you also the lack of trust between the leaders and the citizen, Algerians refused to stay at home, and they actually demonstrated for the 56th of Friday. And that was terrible. We needed actually calls from civil society, from writers such as Yasmina Khadra, from football players who said, please stay home, this is serious. And this shows you that actually there is a total lack of trust, because many Algerians said, no, this is a dirty trick, dirty political trick from the Algerian government, who is trying, you know, to lock down and to kill the Hirak. After a while, of course, the Algerians decided to stay home, and they mobilized differently. As Patricia said earlier, for instance, there was a hashtag going on that the Hirak is going to come back. Many of the Hirakists decided to post videos of the Hirak every Tuesday and every Friday to show that we are not on the street, but we are here symbolically. So, you know, they managed. But for the government, there was a total cacophony. So to start with, on March 17, the Algerian President Abdelmajid Tebboune addressed the nation, and he announced a series of measures. Among these measures to fight coronavirus, there was, restriction, of course, on freedom of movement. These measures included closing nurseries, schools, universities, mosques, shutting down land borders, suspending sea and air connection, and so on and so forth. That was on March 17. And then less than 6 days after that, his health minister, Abdurrahman bin Bouzid, announced that actually we have to prepare for the worst. And he started saying that actually the numbers were increasing. And then what happened is that the figures were questioned by many Algerians who believed and doubt the transparency of their public authorities. Since then, of course, as you said, the number of contaminated people have surged. They reached 5,000 coronavirus cases, and today we have more than 476 fatalities. So we have one of the highest death toll in the Arab region. To this, you need to add the health system. The health system had been in a poor state for years. You need to add to this a very heavy, dysfunctional bureaucracy and severe shortages. So the country is totally unprepared to respond in a coordinated manner to a public health emergency. And the healthcare sector in Algeria is mainly state-run, developed with a focus on guaranteeing, free access to all citizens. But where is the quality in that? It faces major challenges. We are talking here about poor and inconsistent services, lack of operational medical equipment, shortage in medication, weak planning, and so on and so forth. And as a matter of fact, in the first day of the COVID-19, while the number were still low, the health system was unable to respond. And actually the health personnel have been, going on symbolic strike, of course, while trying to continue healing Algerians with the poor means that they had.
I would love to keep going on Algeria, but we have 3 countries to cover. So I want to switch to Lebanon now. And Sammy, ask you, what was so striking about Lebanon's earlier wave of protests was how peaceful and cross-sectarian they were. And this is not something that Lebanon has historically been known for. I mean, Lebanon makes the former Yugoslavia look like Sweden at times. And yet you had this remarkable movement of peaceful protesters from different sects coming together. In recent weeks, however, some of the protests have taken a much darker turn and become much more violent. There have been riots, people have burned banks, many people have been injured, at least one person has been killed. What changed? Why has this round of protests been so different from what we were seeing months ago?
Because in Lebanon, we used to have a very deep political crisis, but now on top of it, you have the most important economic crisis, something unprecedented in the Lebanon history. And this is putting Lebanon in free fall.
And just explain this about a minute. This is a banking crisis that involved the fact that the country's banks were investing people's private savings in the government, which the government was not able to pay back. Right?
People are not able to withdraw their savings. Banks' deposits are totally freezed, and the Lebanese pound has lost up to now more than 150% of its value. 50% of the Lebanese population is under the line of poverty, according to the World Bank. So this is what was changing the unemployment rate, and now it's amplified by the COVID-19 thing has risen by 20%. Today it reached 40%. So you put all this on top of a political crisis that's taking a sectarian dimension that is echoing what's happening in the region, namely the conflict with Iran. So you have all the ingredient of a social explosion. It's true that the revolution that started in October 17 was peaceful, and just to remind you, it started because the authorities dared to increase $6 on the WhatsApp. They came up with this stupid idea of WhatsApp taxes, and this is how they took it to the street. Now all the indicators are in the red, and even third age people are pushing those who were pushing for peaceful demonstration now, because the horizon is bleak, because they are incapable of having access to their savings, because their kids are unemployed. They want things to be more aggressive. This is where we think that the next phase of the revolution will turn more violent, because at the end of the day, you are in face of a population that is disenfranchised, that is impoverished, and that has been fooled. Let's recall that 3 months ago, we had a government. The revolution, the protester managed to topple a government, this consortium of the political establishment, the traditional political forces. They were claiming for an independent government. They came up with an independent government. The facade was an independent government. They came up with people with nice resume, but up to now, they took any decision when it comes to the basic needs, which is the fiscal reforms. They were incapable even to nominate people in the judiciary, in the financial sector, which is very needed in order to engage with the IMF, because the IMF today, a program with the IMF is the only solution available on the table. It's not sure that Lebanon will be capable to engage with the IMF. I'll come to this later. But these protesters have been impoverished, disenfranchised, and they feel today that they have been fooled, because they tend to some of them tend to believe that in fact they had an independent government, and but this independent government proved to be a puppet in the hands of the same traditional forces, and here we are in a deadlock. And this is why I think the COVID-19 thing was just a pause for, but not a stop. The movie was running, the revolution movie. COVID-19, it's like you press pause, but not a stop. And the day the COVID-19 will recede, I think that the protester will take it to the street. And I was saying, I'm afraid that this will turn more violent because the protesters are more desperate.
Sajjad, let's hear what you're seeing in Baghdad. After a long period of crisis, in some ways analogous to what Lebanon has experienced in terms of trouble forming a government, Iraq finally has a new prime minister. What effect has that had on the protests, given that he is fairly well respected? And how well is the new government managing the pandemic, as well as the related crises like the dramatic drop in oil revenues?
Thank you, Jonathan, and I'll add my welcome to yours for everyone joining the webinar today. In regards to Baghdad specifically, protests never really stopped, even though the government restricted movements a couple of months ago in response to the coronavirus pandemic. Numbers decreased. The amount of people who were actually based in the protest site in Tahrir Square, which is in central Baghdad, fell to maybe a couple of hundred. But protests didn't stop, and same for the protest area in Basra and a couple of other cities in Baghdad. However, people realized that the thought of the day focused on whether the government was going to be able to stop the spread of coronavirus. And to be fair, there was actually some goodwill between protesters and health officials in order to try to disinfect some of these protest sites to make sure that coronavirus wasn't going to spread. However, with the fact that 2 prime minister designates failed to get through, and then as oil prices fall into record lows, and as the government has seemed to be getting more and more desperate to try to find a way to stop the crises from overtaking it, the protesters became more ready to increase their activity in the protest sites, but also to call on people to join them, despite the restrictions on coronavirus movements still being there. And what has happened in the last few days has been a new prime minister has come into power, Mustafa al-Kadhimi. Last Thursday was voted in by parliament. And at the same roughly timeline, we've had an increase in activity in protest sites in Kut, in Diwaniyah, in Basra, and in Baghdad. And unfortunately, some of them have got into clashes with security forces. But the expectation is pretty similar to what Sami said with regards to Beirut, is that protests will increase in size and in number and in spread over the coming months for a variety of reasons. One is the new government is not going to be able to take actions quickly enough to satisfy the grievances that are already there. And number 2, we have a difficult situation with regards to ensuring public sector payroll can be maintained, with regards to keeping up with all the demands of government expenditures now that revenues have fallen to record lows for the Iraqi government. We still have the issue of ISIS's resurgence and the question of the amount of security actors being involved in Iraq, some of them being used against protesters themselves. Are they going to continue to weaken Iraq's security apparatus, but also Iraq's political machinery? And then finally, when you put all these together, the amount of people who now don't have jobs has increased from when the protests were 6 months ago to by around 300,000. So just in 6 months, we have 300,000 extra people who are looking for jobs who do not have them. In addition to the amount of people who don't have any incomes, people who are like day laborers, taxi drivers, people who rely on daily income, do wages on a daily basis, they haven't had any sort of income for the last 2 to 3 months. And so they've become more desperate. So I think going forward, the government needs to show goodwill towards the protesters, but also the general public to reassure them that they are going to take steps which will rectify at least what has gone on in the last 6 months. We've had around 700 protesters being killed by government and pro-government forces. We've had a lot of hatred between various groups, not just the protest sites, but parties themselves who are spilling this conversation out into the public, blaming each other for Iraq's ills since 2003. So I think this government, the order of the day is going to be stability, but I'm not sure there will be a lot of patience from protesters.
And how optimistic or pessimistic are you that the government will be able to move quickly to deal with these problems, which most of which, as you say, long predate it?
The Prime Minister has begun. I think the last few days have shown that he's willing to back up his words with some actions. He's done well in terms of trying to reassure the public that he's actually taking all the crises very seriously. So the issues around ISIS, he returned the former head of the CPS to power, the General Abdul Wahab Saadi, who was sacked in September. With regards to dealing with protests, as Patricia mentioned earlier on, released some of the detained protesters, offered compensation to victims of those who were injured and killed, and made a promise that government forces would not respond with force to protesters who were just assembling peacefully. With regards to foreign relations, he's formed a special team to deal with the upcoming dialogue with the US. And with the coronavirus pandemic, he's promised that government response will be adequate, even though we know our healthcare system is not going to be able to accommodate a second wave of coronavirus cases. So I think it's too early to judge with regards to his performance in his government. But I think going forward, people will expect him to continue to backing up his actions with his words with actions. However, is he going to be able to deal with all these crises effectively quickly? I don't think it's possible. As I say, I think he might be able to try to stabilize in terms of stopping the situation from getting worse. But he will need some support for this, both domestically and internationally. And I'm not sure protesters are willing to give him a lot of time. But for now, there is a split in the view between different protest sites. Some people are saying, let's give him a bit of time. Let's give him a chance to try to rectify, mistakes that have been undertaken by his predecessors. It's not just his problem, but it's a problem since 2003. And others are saying, well, actually, he's been voted in by the same powers who were protesting against. He's not going to be able to make much difference. So I think the jury's still out in terms of what the public feels, but it is a good start nonetheless. And though we have a long summer usually of discontent, I think the Prime Minister might be in a position to try to win back some trust from people going forward.
Thanks, Sajjad, and Sami and Dalia and Patricia. I have about 100 more questions for each of you, but I don't want to hog the stage, and we're getting a lot of questions from our audience, so I want to start bringing those in. Just remind you one more time, you can ask questions via the Q&A button on your Zoom app. You can email them to events@foreignpolicy.com, or you can post them on Twitter at #LockdownRiseUp. And when you send them in, please tell us who you are and where you're calling from, or where you're emailing us from. We have a question from Sami Balbaki, who asks about the role of Hezbollah in the virus crisis and in the protests. And I want to expand it slightly to include Iran. As you know, Iran, as everyone knows, I should say, Iran has long been very active in both Iraq and Lebanon, less so in Algeria, often in very negative ways. But of course, Iran has its hands full right now. Not only is it still embroiled in Syria, it is also one of the countries hardest hit by the coronavirus, with the least successful response and a very high level of infections and deaths. And then its economy is melting down because it is being hammered from two sides, by US and international sanctions on the one hand, and then by the decline in oil prices. How has that affected Tehran's behavior, and what are you seeing in terms of their role, positive or negative, in your country? Sajjad, you first, and then Sami.
I mean, protests, when they first began, were quite critical of Iran's involvement in Iraq specifically, and Iran's role. And then there have also been some counter-protests, but as the fallout from the Soleimani assassination in January continued, there were also criticisms of the US in Iraq, and especially their record since 2003. And I think the point where protesters are now is they feel that most countries have no good intentions towards Iraq, in terms of they're seeking their own interests and potentially at the cost of Iraqis themselves. And so if you did a poll right now, probably the majority of protesters would say we wish to limit the influence of both Iran and the US, and probably many other countries. However, at the same time, and I don't see this as being a paradox in any way, they wish to see more support for Iraq from a lot of countries. So they expect the US to give more support to Iraq, even though they don't want the US to interfere. And I think sometimes that message is lost in translation. And going forward, I think Iran will continue to play an important role in Iraq, an influential role, and will be the key player. We cannot remove Iran from the equation, though the US may try to shape its foreign policy that way and try to use Iraq against Iran. That is not what is going to happen. Iran will always have a role in Iraq, but it just means that Iraqi government, and in order to meet the aspirations of its citizens, has got to show that it's in control of its sovereignty. It will limit the negative role of Iran and limit the negative role of countries like the US and others. At the moment, the record over the last year and a half has shown that the government is not capable of doing so. Neither the previous prime minister nor most of the parties in parliament, they seem to fall under the wing of one side or the other. And that's what protesters, led protesters to raise their demands and become more maximalist in terms of changing the entire political system, because they don't believe the current crop of politicians are fully loyal to Iraq. They believe that under certain pressure and influence, they will cede sovereignty and they will allow foreign governments and countries to influence Iraq country.
Thank you. Sami, now tell us how Hezbollah has been playing the crisis, and whether you see a change in Iran's involvement.
Yeah, first, there are two phases in how they dealt with COVID-19, bearing in mind that Hezbollah got the upper hand, has the upper hand in Lebanon, and it's the main backer of the current government. And especially after 2018, the last parliamentary election, he managed to reverse the whole balance of power in his favor inside the institution. So now they have the majority at the executive level and as well as the parliamentary level through their alliances. When the COVID-19 started, at first, all the political establishment, including Hezbollah, were in denial. took the civil society to be the first to call for the lockdown, then they followed. What was striking is that Hezbollah dealt with it in a very decentralized way. I mean, building hospital in its own region. So it was the way he dealt with it and the way the different sectarian groups dealt with it was very decentralized. Now with the crisis, I think there is a setback of Iran in the region. Just to recall, I mean, there are several red lines that Hezbollah put and they were not respected. At first, when the protesters started, Hassan Nasrallah said the toppling the government is a red line, and the government was toppled. Recently, he said there is no way, or not himself, but his deputy, Mr. Naim Qasim, said there is no way we accept IMF, and now this government backed by Hezbollah, they addressed an official letter to the IMF asking for help. So we can talk, as much in Syria, where it's proven by the day that the main regional power there, it's by the day the Russian, and we're seeing this conflicting agenda between Iran and Russia, and the recent dispute between Rami Makhluf and Assad echoes this diverging agenda. So
let's go back to Hezbollah for a second.
Yes, they are in control. Yes, they are in control. Yes, they still got the upper hand, but I'm seeing the influence of Iran declining for the last 3 months.
Well, that's really interesting. And let's go back to Hezbollah for a second. Has their lack of competence and inability to set the terms or the agenda quite the way they used to be able to, do you think that is hurting their standing in the country or their reputation for competence?
I think they are very good in waging guerrilla wars, but in classic wars like in Syria, they didn't manage very well. And in dealing with economic issues, they are not behaving well. The kind of economic recipes they are suggesting are not of the kind to get Lebanon out of the crisis. Like they are trying to fix the exchange rate, for instance, and this is a kind of policies or economic measure that does not work simply.
And is that damaging their public standing?
In my view, they don't have the software to deal with this kind of crisis and this issue.
Is that damaging their public standing?
It's damaging the whole country. Lebanon is in.
No, I understand that, but I mean public support for Hezbollah. Is it declining as a result of this?
This is a very good question. I think he's still, he still count on the sectarian feeling to keep his political base. But in general, I think now the number one concern for all the Lebanese, including Hezbollah, is the economic issue. If he succeeded to get Lebanon out of the crisis, he may regain support. Otherwise, Hezbollah, like all traditional forces, will be the big loser of this crisis.
Okay, thanks. Dalia, I don't want you to think we forgot about you, and the audience hasn't either. Tarek Elias, who's a student at Leiden University in The Hague in the Netherlands, wants to know about the role of the Algerian diaspora and what it can do or is doing to help or affect the current political impasse.
I think the Algerian diaspora, notably the one that is in France, has been doing great this, in February 2019 and throughout 1 year of peaceful Hirak. We've been seeing Algerians of the diaspora in France, in Montreal, in Toronto, in London, taken up to the street every Sunday. We all have these images of Algerian living in France, taken up the street of La République with their Algerian flag and having the same, slogans and chanting the same as their Algerian counterparts. So I think this has been very good. Whether this will continue in France and elsewhere, it's hard to foresee because of the COVID-19, but also because of the, there is a fatigue out there. And this question is not only for the diaspora, it's for the Hirak even in Algeria. You know, the question is, I don't think that Algerians are not going to demonstrate again. I do believe that their will is still there and they will come back. But the question is whether they are coming back with the same numbers, because it's been a year, because some people are just disillusioned. I would say there is, you know, this, it's like a hangover, you know, you had 1 year of happiness, thinking that you can change things, and then you wake up in the morning and you are hangovered because, you know, you see that the system is still there, it's stronger than ever, there is this economic crisis, and people are going also to think about what they have to put in their plates to eat. But of course, as Patricia said, they have nothing to lose. So for many, you know, the question of violence that has been here all this year, you know, whether the security forces are going to use coercive measure or no, might just disappear because people have nothing to lose, so they will go for it. And this leads me to the question of violence, which is very, you know, important, and we need to keep in mind, because for now the military, and I will answer, if you allow me, the question of the military at once. The military has been, you know, staying in the back seat, ruling the country without governing it. Gaid Saleh has been, you know, in the limelight, and then he disappeared. But having a president doesn't mean that the military are, you know, back to their barracks and they are not calling the shots. They are calling the shot, they are taking decision. But one thing that was very noticeable is that the Algerian military did not use any kind of violence against their citizens. But what they did is that they marshaled other security forces, and I am thinking here about the police, to do the dirty work. So my concern for the future is what the security forces are going to do. Because if the regime feel trapped, there is no more, you know, the economic means to buy social peace, as they did it in 2011, as they did it in 2014. There is no more money to buy social peace. There is no more, you know, economic means to have this very generous handout. As a matter of fact, they're already thinking about, you know, reducing subsidies. So when the regime will feel trapped and it doesn't have any means economically or politically, the dirty trick of doing economic reforms, they've been thinking and talking about amending the constitution with more freedom, human rights respect, and so on and so forth. Nobody is buying this. Algerians are fed up with that. They are renegotiating their social contract, and they are ready to do it at any price. And so the question of violence is very important, because I am afraid that when the regime will feel trapped and there is no economic and political reforms and resources, it may have recourse to coercive measures.
Patricia, Ognian Boyadjiev in Bulgaria wants to hear more about the IRI's role in the protests. Is it involved? Has it been involved? How is it helping? What's it doing? And I have to ask you to be brief because we're very short on time. We still want to do one more poll and get some quick wrap-up comments.
Yeah, I'll address it very quickly, but I want to speak about Iran, if I may, for a couple of seconds. Is that okay with you, Jonathan?
Sure.
Very quickly, IRI actually works on sort of the governance equation. So making, as I said in my introductory comments, about making or helping ensure more responsiveness. So we kind of work at the level of that trust, distrust sort of place, if you will. Like we engage in focus groups. Our recent focus groups in Basra have kind of established the depth of the distrust that there is. So our aim is to actually strengthen political parties, civil societies, and enable them to kind of push for more responsiveness or be more inclusive, so to speak. So we do recognize that these protests are sort of sovereign and patriotic and grassroots, and nobody wants to mess with that. Like, it's important to kind of watch where the protests are going, assess their impact, but also ensure at the governance level that there is kind of a movement to take that into account. I just want to very quickly say something about Iran in Iraq and Lebanon. I do want to say that in response to your question, that I think that there is sort of an opportunity there in terms of public awareness. I think we need to remember that the protests were also, the slogans of the protests were, in Lebanon, all means all, or everyone means everyone, كلهم يعني كلهم. In Iraq, they were like barra barra, everybody barra barra, external influences. I think at this moment, there is not a retraction of Iran in Iraq, but a sort of tactical pausing, if you will, and a recognition that they've been depleted by the impact both of COVID-19 and the loss of Soleimani, and the recognition that they may have less control over warlordism. But I think we need to remember that there is a deep state that is co-opted and captured to a great extent by Iran, and there are proxies which are in their employ. So I think they're moving to a plan B. However, Lebanon, I think they cannot afford to lose. I think if they lose Lebanon, they lose the country. And so I think in Lebanon, I mentioned that there is an effort at a PR campaign, or there's an extensive PR campaign that's underway. And this is in the context of, and adding to what Sami said, that in the beginning, there were all sorts of Twitter hashtags sort of trending that were blaming Hezbollah and supporters for starting the outbreak because of the ties to Iraq. In fact, some of the first patients that were diagnosed had traveled to Qom for pilgrimage. So, and Qom became the outbreak, the heart of the outbreak in Iran. So Hezbollah was initially accused of staging a cover-up to hide the infection rate, and sort of there were tweets of image, mocking Hezbollah, sort of welcoming the virus to Lebanon on planes. But I think there's a volte-face that happened with Hezbollah sort of engaging in a PR campaign. And again, as Sami said, outside of the state, interestingly enough, deploying sort of volunteers, fleets of ambulances, taking journalists around on press tours. And interestingly enough, that was launched, in parallel with state effort, taking into account that they also control the health ministry, which is in charge of state efforts. So it was almost like trying to shift the narrative from being blamed to being the only actor sort of being able to deal with it. But I'm not sure that this campaign is working. So just leave it at that. But I just wanted to make sure.
Thanks. Okay, so it's almost time for us to wrap up now. But before we do, we're going to take the poll again to see how this discussion has changed people's minds. As before, you can only access the poll via Zoom, but if you're on Zoom, you should see the question popping up, and it's the same one as before. How optimistic or pessimistic are you about the future of the protest movements in the course of this, or in the teeth of this pandemic? As we wait for results, I want to ask each of the panelists to quickly give us their final thoughts, and especially tell us, are you optimistic or pessimistic, and why? But very briefly, Patricia, let's start with you, since you were just talking. Optimistic, pessimistic, why? You're muted.
I am optimistic. I'm optimistic because this is sort of unheard of. I'm optimistic because also of the confluence of issues that are making it such that it's going to be difficult for these regimes to reassert themselves. And if they turn to violence, it's going to be even more difficult for them to justify it.
Thank you. Dalia.
I would say that the Hirak, be it in Lebanon or in Algeria or in Iraq, is going to adapt, is already adapting. But let us not forget that they have regimes in front of them that are also adapting. And they are doing it, depending on which country, pretty well. And if they don't adapt, they will have recourse to coercive measure. So, and unfortunately, and I will be blunt about it, if they do have recourse to coercive measures, I don't think that the European Union, for instance, is ready to have, or is, as a matter of fact, interested in democracy right now. What they are interested in is stability. Stability at any cost, well, they will do it.
Thank you. Sajjad, how are you feeling? Optimistic, pessimistic, and why?
Short-term pessimistic, long-term optimistic. In the short term, things will get worse. I mean, there's a lot of staking in Iraq. There's a lot of actors. There's a lot of weapons, and power is decentralized, it's diffuse. And it's not just the government against the people. It's much more complicated than that. So I think there is much more competition, and things will get worse. But eventually, medium to long term, I'm more optimistic for reforms and improvement in Iraq.
Thank you. And Sami, how would you answer the question?
The same as Sajad. I'm very concerned on the very short term. The very harsh times are waiting Lebanon because of the economic crisis. However, I'm more optimistic on the long run because, first of all, this political establishment is bankrupt and economically and politically. And very good news for Lebanon. This revolution is really a blessing. It proved to be a driver for change. It crossed the sectarian issue was key for a pluralist society like Lebanon. So they are really a driver for hope.
Well, you know, this is remarkable in this time of COVID-19 pandemics, quarantines, lockdowns, and truly horrific economic and human costs. Good news stories are very hard to find, but there has been a lot of cause for hope in this conversation, and it's reflected in our audience poll. We actually moved the dial from 52% optimistic in the first poll to 56% optimistic at the end. Sorry, it was 52% pessimistic to 56% optimistic. So that's what, an 8-point swing in the positive direction. We could easily keep talking about each one of these countries for several hours more, especially with experts as knowledgeable as yourselves, but I'm afraid we have to stop there. I want to thank you all, Patricia, Dalia, Sajad, Sami, for taking the time to talk with us. I want to thank the International Republican Institute for working with us on this great dialogue. And I want to thank everyone who's called in for listening and for participating. Please stay tuned for more events like this here at Foreign Policy, including a virtual dialogue next Thursday, May 21st, with the winners of the 2020 Lionel Gelber Book Prize. More information on this and other events is available at foreignpolicy.com. Events. Thank you again to everyone. Be well, stay safe, and I hope to see you soon. Bye-bye.